This is the Grays Innovation Classic, and in this review I'll be telling you what I like about it and what type of player it's suitable for. Okay, so let's talk about these specs and text. When you first buy this racket, it weighs 154.5 grams. That's including the grommets, the strings, and of course the original grip that it comes on. Once I put my grip on, it weighed 166.5. Now that will change depending on how much of a grip you put. You might hold the racket really very high and you'll have a more of a grip, I suppose. So that will actually change. The balance point when it's originally sold for this racket was 350 millimeters, which means it's more or less an evenly balanced racket. Once I put my grip on, that became 330, making this a headlight racket, and that's important for some of the other things I'm going to talk about in the review. As far as the technology is concerned, this racket uses something called hypercarbon, which is normally used in aeronautical and nautical situations, but it's becoming more and more common in other fields, especially in sports equipment. I can't tell you exactly what it does. I think that it makes the racket a little bit more rigid, and this racket is quite rigid, and I like that, so that's quite useful for me. Other technology is what's called the perimeter weighting system, where basically they put more weight in this area of the racket than they do here and here, because that helps when you hit off center, it stops the racket from twisting. As far as the racket shape is concerned, it's obviously a teardrop, which means that it's got quite a large head. It has what is I now consider to be the normal. It goes from thick to thin to thicker. But the good thing about this racket is it's not too thick around the base, and that's good for me because I like to try and put my finger around, and I recommend other people do that. And sometimes it's actually quite large around the base for some of the other rackets. And if you like that, fantastic. But I don't, and so this was really quite nice for me. There's nothing ostentatious about this racket. As you can see, it has a darker grey colourway with lime green and turquoise. It is unique enough to be recognisable, but not particularly memorable. But that's okay. Rackets don't have to be shouting in your face the colour schemes. They just have to be able to, when you see it once, you can recognise it the next time. And that one does this. Being a teardrop means that it inherently has a lot of power, but it's not the thing that jumps out at me when I was hitting with this. It's not the thing that I said to myself, wow, this racket is really powerful. Yes, you can hit it hard, but that's not the reason that I would buy this racket. It is not the racket's raison d'etre. Other things are important for this racket, but yes, in answer to your question, can I hit it hard? Yes, you can. It took me a little while to become comfortable playing softer touch shots with this. Not because there's anything wrong with this racket, but because the racket I had come from was a significantly different racket. It was more power based and it was much more flexible. This is, as I've already mentioned, a little bit stiffer, and as I've already mentioned, is a little bit headlight. So at the beginning when I was first playing drops, I found it quite difficult to get the right power, the right amount of push, for example, not power. And when I was playing very high cross-court nicks, or trying to, I just couldn't get my timing right. But over the next few hours, in total time of hitting, not just on one time, sorry. Over the next few hours, it began to feel really comfortable, and I was able to hit all the types of shots that I like to hit, and it had a wide variety of abilities. So as far as touch and control, this racket will be able to give you that, definitely. So let's talk about the things that I think this racket does really well. Well, the first thing I want to talk about is forgivability. Now, it's not a real word, but what I'm talking about is you have a sweet spot. The sweet spot is the part of the racket where when you hit the ball in that area, it responds beautifully. There's very little, if any, vibration up to up through your wrist and to your arm, and it feels like you've just hit the ball in the perfect place. This has a large sweet spot. But what it also has is that when you do hit the ball on the outside of that sweet spot, it responds really nicely. Now that might be related to the fact that it's got this perimeter weighting system. It's quite unusual because normally a racket that is quite rigid like this one, quite stiff, normally gives you less forgivability when you're outside of the sweet spot, but this one does that really well. Now that could be to do with the type of strings, which by the way feel really nice, and when I say feel really nice, I am talking about how they hit the ball, but the way that they touch, there's a little bit of texture there, and I really quite like that. Anyway, sorry, back on topic. You can hit the ball off center, off sweet spot, and it will still be really, really nice. Now, talking about the sweet spot, this one does seem to have quite a large sweet spot, and that's obviously really nice as well. But it also has what I'm calling a super sweet spot, and that means that there is one spot on this racket where when you do hit the ball in that place, it feels absolutely fantastic. It feels great when you hit the ball in most of the racket, but there is one spot that is really, really good, and that's important for the type of player that I'm going to mention later on. Following on from the forgivability section, I want to talk about the top string control, and it's a separate section because that's really important. How a racket responds down here is quite useful. I mean, hopefully you never hit it here, but you do hit it up here, or you should be hitting it up here, because hopefully your opponent is hitting it quite tight. Well, maybe not hopefully, but your opponent is hitting the ball quite tight, and you have to make contact with the ball here. And I found that when I was hitting the ball up here, I was able to keep the ball tight. In fact, I think I'd probably hit the wall with this racket quite a lot, because my previous shot was always quite tight. I was then hitting the wall again with it, if that makes sense, but you know what I mean. Obviously, when you're playing against somebody and you're on a court, that's a little bit different. But when I was hitting with this alone, solo practice, I found that I could hit lots of straight, tight shots, and that was really, really good. And I think that that's a really important guide as to how good a racket or how useful a racket is. Maneuverability is the idea of how easy is it to move a racket, and essentially that's mostly to do with, is it head heavy or is it head light? But there's more to it than that. It's more to it to do, it's partly to do with the shape and the distribution of weight. So this racket feels incredibly maneuverable. I like to do that exercise where I get to the front of the court and I'm just hitting the ball forehand, backhand volleys, and I'm trying to do it as fast and as accurately as possible. And this racket felt really good doing that. It also helps when you've got reaction volleys, as long as you don't just have your wrist or your racket right down by your feet, as long as you've got your racket around your waist. If a ball comes past you, it's easy to feel that you're going to hit the ball really nicely, because you can maneuver the racket to get there in time. Following on from the idea of maneuverability is the general idea of volleys. Now, often with volleys you have a shorter swing, and that's important to know how the racket responds to that. In general, rackets that are a little bit head heavier work really well with volleys, because there's more of the weight at the end of the racket, and if you haven't had a big swing, then the racket has to do much of the work. This racket works really well with volleys, but I did find that I had to keep my wrist a little bit firmer. Now, that's really good for everybody, because everybody should generally be keeping their wrist firmer unless you have a huge amount of control. So for beginners, they might find that that's a little bit difficult at first because they're used to moving too much wrist, but once you become accustomed to it, this racket kind of forces you to improve your technique. Once you do that and you hit the ball cleanly, this racket responds really well. I had issues volleying the ball, which sometimes happens with headlight rackets. Following on from the idea of the maneuverability, I want to talk specifically about the back wall corners. Because this racket was so well balanced, because this racket has such a large sweet spot and is forgiving, I found that I was able to take the balls out of the back corner better than I can with most other rackets. Now, you might think that I can hit any shot. Well, if you do, thank you very much. But you might think that I can hit nearly every shot off the back wall. But there are times when the ball is very low and is very tight to the wall, and I would have taken it earlier. But I did a routine where I hit everything off the back wall. Some of the times I got it, some of the times I didn't. But I found that I was able to hit more straight drives with this than I would have done with some other rackets. As I said, partly because it's headlight and partly because it's more forgiving. I wasn't able always to be able to get the ball right to the back, but I was able to keep it straight. Now, that might sound like a criticism, but what I'm suggesting to you is that the combination of headlight and more forgivability gave me the chance to get more shots straight than I might have done normally. I might have had to have boasted shots. So this is a racket that I would say works really well in the back corners, both forehand and backhand. This brand is probably the oldest current manufacturer of squash equipment in the world. 1855 is when they've started. Now, they still make cricket equipment and rugby equipment, and maybe some other things as well, but you might not have heard of them in the squash world because they become less available, which we'll talk about in a moment. What I'm trying to tell you is that with their long history coupled with their huge experience, you're buying a brand that you can trust. And when I worked for Dunlop, Prince and Grays were our major competitor, so they've been around a long time. If you live in Europe, the only place you can get these is from Norway. If you live in the USA, Asia or Australia, you can get them directly from Australia. Now I'd like to thank Steve from squash.com.au and Stig from Squash Butikken for being so helpful and friendly, and for obviously supplying the rackets. The link is in the text description to their websites, and I highly encourage you to go check them out. They have also supplied me 4 other Grays rackets, and I will be reviewing those over the coming months, so look out for those. I have no hesitation in recommending this racket for all styles and all standards of player. Beginners will enjoy and benefit from the large sweet spot and the maneuverability, as well as the forgivability around the edge of the racket. Better players will also enjoy that large sweet spot and the maneuverability of being able to get the ball out of the corner and hit it straight down the wall, giving you so many more options. And more advanced players will enjoy the ability to hit the ball very tight on the top of the strings. So all in all, this is a racket that's suitable for everybody. Now that's unusual because normally a particular racket works well for one type of style or one type of standard, but this one really is really good for everybody. If you said to me, Philip, this is what you have to play with for whatever reason, I would be more than happy playing with for the rest of my time with this racket. Now, one thing that it might appeal to you is that because this racket is a little bit difficult to get hold of, you might have a little cachet when you take it to your club. You've got the ubiquitous Dunlop unsquashable Technifiber. Everybody's got one of those, but maybe you're the kind of person who wants something that's a little bit unusual or rarer, and this racket could be for you. I encourage you to look at the websites to see if they're available near you, and I highly encourage you to at least try one of these. If you think the content of my videos is useful, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on notifications. This is a playlist of the technical aspects of squash, which probably interests you if you've watched this video. This is a video that YouTube thinks is a really good fit for you. Thanks for watching, and remember, do something every single day to improve your squash. See ya!